It's a real honor. I suppose if we did have scriptural texts tonight, they would be faith without works is dead, and by their works shall you know them. And if you knew, for anyone who knows about Tim Shriver's works, we know that they are good. In fact, we know that they are great. He is chair of the Special Olympics. In his 11 years as head of the Special Olympics, he's launched the organization's most ambitious growth agenda. He's also worked with world leaders. This is a great list. I got to read it. Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Bertie Ahern, Rafiq Hariri, Thabo Mbeki, Julius Nyerere, Hosni Mubarak, and Shimon Peres, crossing many of us. That's a pretty good list. To advance the growth of...
Got him on speed dial. Hold on.
Yes, several of them are going to show up late this evening. To advance the growth of the Special Olympics mission and vision while challenging nations to adopt more supportive and just policies. He has also spared programs in developing or war-torn countries, including Afghanistan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Iraq, and he's here to talk about it. Before joining the Special Olympics, Dr. Shriver was, and he remains, an educator who's focused on social and emotional factors in learning. He created the New Haven Public Schools Social Development Project. He co-founded the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. I could use some help on those things myself. It's the leading research organization in the U.S. In the field of social and emotional learning. He got his undergraduate degree from Yale, a master's degree in religion and religious education at Catholic University, and a doctorate in education at the University of Connecticut. He's written in lots of places, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Commonweal. One of my highest honors as a writer is I shared a Christmas Day page in the Washington Post with Tim Shriver. I decided that we would get letters charging an excessive preference for Roman Catholics on Christmas Day on the op-ed page of the Washington Post. So as far as I can tell, they did not get such a complaint. What we're going to do tonight is I'm going to ask a few questions. Oh, I also want to say that I think most of you know this, but Ibu Patel ended up not being able to make it in from Chicago. He had a very important family issue. He really is very sorry that he couldn't be here, but we're going to reschedule him somehow. I can tell you it's, his reason is an extremely good one, and our thoughts are with him tonight. I'm going to start by asking Tim a few questions, and then I want to open it up to the audience. The second question I'm going to ask him, by the way, at his suggestion is there a difference between your faith and your religion, which I think is a very interesting philosophical question. But I wanted to begin simply by asking, how has your faith affected, inspired, complicated your professional and public life? And if you could sort of talk about that. Welcome, Tim. It's really good.
Thank you. Thank you, EJ. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I was going to use the line about sharing the op-ed page with EJ, but he beat me to it. But I will say that in addition to being a huge fan of both his op-ed pieces, his columns, as well as his work in longer form and in book form, I also get to check on his Sunday attendance at Mass, because we used to share the same Mass, but I'm assuming he's changed because I haven't seen him in a couple of weeks. So the Jesuits here can check in on that later and see if confession is in order. But it's a great privilege to be with EJ, who's really thought as much about the issue of at least progressive politics and the role of religion, in particular the Catholic tradition, as anybody, certainly in the public forum, and to be thinking with him. And really this, Evan invited me, and I'm very grateful to Evan for a discussion. So even though EJ started me off with a question about faith in my own life, I'll try to go quickly and encourage this as a discussion, because there's lots of folks in this room that have very powerful experiences in this space, and as always, getting and listening to everyone is really the heart of the conversation. Let me take off on and make a sort of a subtle challenge to EJ's textual choices on James and faith without works, and you shall know them by their works. And do this a little bit by chronicling my own childhood, and I also want to welcome my daughter who just walked in late. So I grew up with two parents who were very active in public ways. My mother's family included politicians, and one of whom, as some of you may know, was President Kennedy, and obviously two brothers in the Senate. And my father was active in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and then seeking political office himself. By the time, I did this on the way over here, by the time I was 9 years old, between my birth and the age of 9, my parents, between them, had created Special Olympics, Head Start, the Peace Corps, the Job Corps, Legal Services, Neighborhood Youth Corps, Indian Opportunities, and a series of research centers around the world working in research in the field of mental retardation in the language of the day, what we used to call university-affiliated programs. I think 12 in this country, and the NICHD. All of those institutions were the result in some respect of my parents' work to some degree or another. Between 0 and 9. Nothing before I was born, by the way. But after I was born, quite a lot of productivity. The underlying faith message that powered that era for me was about faith and works. It was the admonition heard frequently in Catholic and other Christian circles from St. Timothy, from St. Paul, to those whom much is given, much is expected. There was an enormous emphasis on the Catholic social gospel, on the works required of a person of faith, on the energy required to fulfill the obligations of faith, the duty of faith. That made a lot of sense to me, and it made a lot of sense to a lot of people, and I think it still makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. If you are of faith, you have an obligation, a duty, a requirement to provide some form of service, some form of social justice action, some form of financial contribution, some personal giving back to society. I think at the same time, in that same window of time, I had a completely different experience of my faith. And I'll describe it by using a story. I think it must have been when I was about 5 years old. My mother was running a camp at our house for people with intellectual disabilities. And that camp at the time was drawing from people mostly from institutions. In those days, 65, 64. People with intellectual disabilities were routinely given to institutions for care, or routinely abandoned by families, not all, but many. And those that were living at home routinely were not going to schools, and if they went to schools, they were going to special schools. So this camp took place in my backyard, and I can remember some mornings looking out my window, second floor window, and these buses would pull up. We lived at a farm in Rockville. These buses would pull up, and about 100 or 150 people with special needs would pour out of these buses, and they'd gather in this kind of yard area in the front of our house where there was a flagpole. And I would sit there and look out the window at them and watch them proceed off these buses. Some with helmets, some with quite severe challenges, some with significant behavior problems, not diagnosed in the current language with the current terms, but nonetheless sort of coming to my house. And we would raise the flag, the bugler would play the national anthem, and they would all stand around, and then they would sing "If You're Happy and You Know It." If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, you know the song. And I think back on that a lot, and I thought back on it, I thought about it through my whole life, and I thought about, what is going on out there, really? I didn't think of it as 6 as what's going on out there, but I can see now that I was wondering. These were not people that we were going to fix. Why was my mother having them to my house? What is this happy and you know it? Didn't seem to be all that clear, the trajectory toward happiness and fulfillment. It was fun. I could go out and play kickball and do arts and crafts in my own backyard with campers and counselors. So there was a lot of fun. Come on in, there's seats at the front.
It's like church, no one ever wants to sit in the front.
But I can see now, in retrospect, that there was a different side of religious questions that I was asking, even in those moments. Not so much about what I ought to do, but what it meant. Not so much about what the action required or the duty required was, but about what we were really looking for. Questions of meaning and value that were questions, not answers. The social gospel gave us answers around social justice, around the ethics and morals of the Catholic tradition, but of the Christian and the Judeo-Christian more broadly. But these moments were not giving me answers. They were giving me questions. I think those stayed with me for a long time. I think what happened to me when I left college was I was very immersed in education. I went in to work in low-income and minority communities, and they came back to me in a big way because none of those kids had any interest in my answers. I went out into the neighborhoods of New Haven and spent 6 years failing, to be blunt. Failing in large part because I thought it was my duty to help them, because it was my obligation to add value, because I had a good education and I wanted to share it, because I wanted to make these kids successful the way I had been taught success was to be defined, because I had a social and political agenda defined by the Democratic Party and by progressive politics that said I ought to be engaged, I ought to make a difference, I ought to fix the problem. And basically most of those kids flipped me the bird. My first experience in a public school in New Haven when I was a junior in college, I went into the school building, and I've told this story to my daughter many times, and I was asked to be a hall monitor. And so you sit, if you're a hall monitor, you sit in the middle of the hall and you make sure kids, if they come out of their classroom, go back in. If they want to go to the bathroom, they have a pass. And a kid walks out, I say, "You have a pass?" He says, "No." He turns and goes to walk out the door, and I says, "You can't walk out the door." He turned, he said, "Fuck you," and then walked out the door. And excuse my language, fathers, but I thought to myself, this is going to be interesting. This is not a place where I am going to be able to provide all the answers. So over time, these kids would say to me, in so many words, "I'm not buying it. I don't see the value in doing my chemistry homework. I don't see the meaning in working harder. I don't buy into the system you're selling." They were in effect asking me questions of what mattered. And that's what led me to Catholic University, and not to study the social tradition, but I ended up studying mystics. And there I found, Meister Eckhart saying, "Let God be God in you." And the cloud of unknowing saying, you have to enter into through a cloud of forgetting, to a space of emptiness. And you have to discover within yourself God. I heard St. Francis say, what you are looking for is what is looking. And I heard these kids coming back to me, these teenagers, who had basically said to me, the illness I'm struggling with is not an illness of poverty, it's an illness of feeling humiliated. It's an illness of rejection, it's an illness of being put down. I don't need your smarts or your social action or your duty or your obligation. I'm willing to listen to you, but you're going to first have to listen to me. There was an inward journey to my faith trajectory, to my faith journey, that all of a sudden burst on the scene, and I realized, for my own part, that social change and social action in politics was going to have to, for me at least, take a spiritual turn, and not be defined only by policy and legislation and action and social parameters, but by the inward journey to understand my own faith and understand and listen to the faith of others. As I thought back on this, I can see in this matching of what in the old language we used to call contemplation and action, the inner life and the outer life, faith and morals versus spirituality. I can see a common pathway in the work of my parents. My father's work in the Peace Corps, if you think about it, one of the radical ideas still in the Peace Corps, and still radical in the world of foreign assistance, is the idea that volunteers had to be eye to eye, heart to heart, in community. The model was not of a technical transfer of goods or services, but of a human relationship. Was first to listen and understand. Jerry Critchley and the team from Peace Corps that's been so active around here knows this better than I do. Those people were charged not to go out and change the world, but to go out and understand the world. The inner journey of the invitation of faith, and in those days it's shocking to know that Peace Corps volunteers were given books, amongst which was Teilhard de Chardin. I don't think you could do that anymore in a public institution, give a Jesuit-written book that was a reflection on cosmology and mystical anthropology, but
You actually get hit from the right end.
Yeah, probably, exactly. You'd never make it. What's the point? In the end of the day, I guess I want to summarize by saying I believe that the journey, the territory, if you will, between faith and politics or faith and policy has been too often defined by how do we politicize religion? How do we take the adages of religion and insert them into the political sphere? How do we take the political advantage gained from religion and use it for political purposes? The great challenge of our time, which in my view is a spiritual age, not a religious age, we are embarking, and I think there are signs everywhere of a spiritual age, is how do we spiritualize politics? How do we take the insights of the spiritual traditions of all the religions, which are remarkably common, and use those spiritual insights, and in fact use the spiritual disciplines that ask us first to change before we change others, and use those to infuse political life with the values that come from the experience of the divine. Now, if you go back and look at this, I'll give you an example of the balance between faith and works and faith and spirituality. One of my role models, and the role model of many people I'm guessing here, is Dorothy Day. If you read Dorothy Day as a writer about Catholic social justice, you will read her and hear in her the demand for social change, the demand for a radical reallocation of wealth, the demand that the wealthy end the carnage, really, of capitalism. But if you read her spirituality, you will hear in her the discovery of Christ, the discovery of Christ in the other, the radical commitment to live amongst the poor, not to help the poor, to be open to listening to all of the pain, all of the struggle of what it means to love someone else, to enter into a relationship of love and personal transformation. You hear in that the seeds, the energy which channels the demand for social change, not the other way around. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but the inner life in her, and I brought text which we can share later if we have time, but the inner life is really the engine of her change. Another great role model of mine, Jean Vanier, some of you may have heard of, the founder of the L'Arche communities where people live in community, those with severe intellectual disabilities and those who do not have disability. There are several L'Arche communities here in Washington. But Jean Vanier writes about his desire for intimacy. And he speaks over and over again of the enormous faith that has come from what he has learned from people with severe disabilities because he was forced to stop. Because he says, I learned to bend down, to sit, to listen. Those, in my upbringing, were separate from action. Those are the things that contemplatives do, or people behind cloistered walls do, or silent people do, or people self-absorbed do. For me, they became the engine of understanding the connection of my faith. I think I've recovered, in my own tradition, the Catholic tradition, the faith that came from the mystics, to my view, the faith that comes from the prophets and the Gospels, not as much about the teachings that focus on ethics and morals, but the invitation to personal transformation and to the discovery of giftedness in others. It is no longer for me pity for people with intellectual disabilities, but it is how can I be a vehicle to unlock their gifts. It is no longer about giving service to others. We hear a lot about service now. Harris Wofford, one of the greatest champions of service in the history of the United States of America, bar none. But it's not service to others, but service with. We have to remove the condescension and the hierarchies in the paradigms of social change, even in our faith. The arrogance sometimes of duty. The arrogance of duty. And replace it with a transformative love of relationship and empowering of all people, the discovery of giftedness in others. If I had to summarize my entire journey, it would be to say that I have tried to come to understand how my faith invites me to always look first to the discovery of the gift in the other, not to look first in what I can do to help anyone be blunt. So that's probably too long, EJ, for a starting point, but I'll close with a quick story, which I hope will reflect this. We, in our family, have have played on all of my children, starting with my daughter Rose, who's here, who started a unified Special Olympics bowling program and before that coached in a basketball program. All of our children have played on unified sports teams in the Special Olympics communities in Bethesda. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we were leaving a practice on a Saturday morning in February in a 20-degree day or so. And my children had all come. We split into cars, my wife going one way, me going another way, each of us with 2 kids. Anyway, we're driving down 270 back from this special school that's out in Rockville. And I was thinking, I had 2 sons in the car, must have been 10 and 14 at the time, and I was thinking to myself, you know, these 2 boys got up at 8:30 in the morning. They had to drive all the way out to this school. They played in a little undersized gym with people with significant challenges. They're both very good athletes. They could play at a higher level. They could be sleeping in. They could be doing iPods. They could be doing a lot of things. I'm betting they're doing this just to please me. I want to tell them they don't have to do this for that reason. So I said to them, you know, what did you guys think of the practice today? My son Sam in the front and Tim in the back. They said fine, it was fine. And I said, no, but really, what did you guys think? What do you really think of this experience of playing on this unified team? And they're like, it's fine, it's good, went well. So, you know, I turn off the radio, and they're like, what did you do that for? You know? I said, I really want to know. I want to know what you guys think about this experience. And so there's sort of a long silence, and in the front seat, my son Sam says, okay, Dad, it's like this. If you tell me we're going to Disney World, I'd say that's about the most fun thing you could tell me. We would have so much fun, it would be such a blast, all the rides, all the excitement would be great. But the problem is, when it's over, it sucks. And I hate when vacations end. He says, but when you go to Special Olympics, it's the kind of fun that lasts. Now he says, turn the radio back on. I think what he was talking about, the difference between fun that doesn't last and fun that does, I think at some level, those children are being invited to a personal discovery of what matters to them, of what, if you're happy and you know it, is all about, of meaning and value that transcends fixing anything. It transcends obligation, it transcends duty, it certainly transcends order or admonition. It's an invitation to a kind of, if I can say, religious experience or faith-based experience that I think the churches now have this enormous responsibility to cultivate in an era when the old model, I think, is fading fast. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I feel like after that unbelievably moving talk, we should have an altar call. So I just want everybody to come up and commit to Tim's spiritual vision. That was amazing. I do want to welcome Harris Walker, who's one of my heroes. It's so great to see you and your service got a great victory today in the House. Over 300 votes for 250,000. Oh,
thanks to your call.
No, I wish. And Rose, I want to welcome Rose. You know, we at GPBI, this is our second Shriver event. The event we did for Tim's dad, Rose's granddad, was one of the great events we did. So Rose, I can't wait to do one for you, and that's not intended to pressure you anyway. And the third thing, you talked about the cloud of forgetting. It did remind me of one of my favorite put-downs, which comes from the Jesuits, a very prominent American who was a Jesuit for a brief period. And a friend of his put him down by saying, you know, the Jesuits spend the first 2 years tearing the mind down and the second 2 years building it up. Long pause. You spent 2 years in the Jesuits, didn't you? I want to take this in a completely different direction, inspired by your talk. I think that for an awful lot of people, I know myself, it's a lot easier to take the ethical demands and admonitions seriously in politics than to spiritualize politics or to draw spiritual sustenance from public action. And I wonder if you have a word for, you know, the many people who are committed in public life in various ways, not just in politics, but in all kinds of things that people do, who put their faith in action, and yet worry about the faith. The faith sometimes gets lost along the way. How do you nurture the spiritual side in action? I mean, in a way, that's what your whole talk was about, but I would like you to talk a little more about that, because we almost always deal with it the other way around. We almost always talk about, well, here are the logical things that need to happen in public life because of what the prophets say, because of what Jesus says, because of what the scriptures say. How do you do it the other way around?
Well, if the question is how do you nurture your own spiritual life as a political figure, I think there are 1,000 answers to that. The one answer, which I think is consistent across people in politics that we might consider successes in this regard, is they take prayer and ritual very seriously. I think if you look again at Dorothy Day, daily celebration of the Liturgy of the Hours, daily Mass, daily prayer, daily quiet. I mean, this is arguably one of the, in fact is on the road to sainthood, or arguably one of the great saints of the Catholic tradition, and certainly in the American experience. As an activist, this is a woman who was relentlessly active, but who took prayer and the disciplines of prayer very seriously. In other words, the cultivation of her own inner life very seriously. So I'd say on the one hand, yes, you shall know them by their deeds, but you shall also know them by their prayer. I think you can see in people and sense in people the authenticity that comes from somebody who has a clear sense of who they are. We talk about this in politics a lot, authenticity. And you can see it in someone. Well, this person has it, this person doesn't. I think people frequently make mistakes about authenticity. I think, for instance, I'll say something which maybe people here will think I'm crazy for saying, but I think George Bush won a lot of political points because he communicated authenticity. Not necessarily accuracy and not necessarily thoroughness, but I think people felt at an intuitive level, take the political positions out of it, but he was elected president twice, in my view, because people felt he was saying what he felt. Now, I don't know I'm not judging him beyond that, but I do think that part of the issue in politics is that people become inauthentic quickly. They get distracted by power, they get distracted by attention, they get very, very clouded by their own egos, and they lose the capacity to ground themselves in their own spiritual life. I don't know if that's the question you're asking exactly, EJ, but I think in the end of the day, the big responsibility now, in my view, in this era, is not on political institutions. It's on religious institutions. Jamie Price, a mentor of mine, has written this short monograph about how religions need somebody to do for them what Jefferson did for politics. What Jefferson did for politics was to separate creed from spirit. He never said that spirituality or the inner life or the desires or the longings of faith should be excluded, but he said we will not have creed in politics. Religions need the same thing. Religions need, if you look, and there, I think some are getting it, if you look at the ad, I don't know if you've seen the ad for the Catholic Church that's out there now. I don't know if any of you have seen it. They've got a public servant, well, it's not public, I'm sure they're paying for it. But the ad, I think, reads, look, are you looking for something? Dad, maybe it's God. That's a different ad than we would have seen, I think, 10 years ago. Certainly, again, speaking as a Catholic. So beginning to cultivate in their political leaders a sense of the inner life of spirituality that will allow people to create innovations like the Peace Corps that emphasize the importance of a spiritual connection amongst people as part of a political agenda. That would be, I don't know, again, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly, but I do think the primacy of relationship. You look at development, I'll give you an example. The development assistance in the United States, as I see it, is almost exclusively managed by technicians whose job it is to deliver aid. U.S. aid, A-I-D. It's to deliver aid. It is not to change the relationship between this country and people in the developing world. It is not to increase understanding. It is not to break down barriers of mistrust. It is not to overcome the fear that comes from Muslims and Christians and Jews not understanding or knowing one another. It is not to promote American values or ideals. It is not to say we believe in freedom, equality, dignity. It is not to say we believe and we're ready to serve with you in your communities, to build your communities, and we want you to come and serve in ours. It is not to do any of that. It is to transfer goods and services from the developed world, from the United States to the developing world. And as a result, the constituency for USAID in this country is non-existent. And I bet in the enormously literate world that we have in here, there's not 5 people here who know the last 3 administrators of USAID. Arguably the most influential American in the world promoting our agenda in relationship to the developing world. Nobody knows who they even are. Because there is no spirituality in that model. I don't want to say there's no spirituality in the people, because I'm sure many good people are there and trying very hard. But the model, to me, is a model predicated on a transfer of goods. We have, you don't, we give, you receive. We're smart, you're not. We're rich, you're poor. We're giving, you're receiving. Say thank you, be appreciative, we love you, take it. It's not a spiritual, it's not a religiously grounded model. If you look at the prophets in the way I read them, or if you look at the gospel, or if you look at the church, the greatest models of social transformation speak to the personal transformation of relationship as unleashing a change in both the giver and the receiver, not a transaction that transfers goods and services from one to the other.
Let me totally reverse field on you, since you're answering the questions and I can ask them. And, somebody comes into this room and says, how dare you inject spirituality or religion in public life? We're a country where 15 to 20% of us at least are non-believers. We're very diverse: Christian, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, Sikh, Hindu, and Confucian. This is all very dangerous. Why do you need to drag your spirituality into public life in the first place?
Well, I mean, I'm not a philosopher, and I leave this to great philosophers. What's the big difference between somebody who's, let's say, a secular humanist and somebody who's a spiritual person in politics? The major difference, in my view, is that one person believes in a transcendent reality and the other doesn't. So what does it mean that I believe in a transcendent reality and you don't, practically speaking? I would argue that my position makes a hell of a lot more sense politically than yours, but that would be a more protracted discussion about whether...
How so? Just take that briefly.
Briefly. Well, this is it's an interesting question. Does it make more sense to construct the social order, to construct the idea of social justice, to construct the idea of community, of participation, of a shared future, all the things that are required for the creation of the social good in secular terms? Can you justify that more by arguing that a transcendent value exists, or by arguing that a transcendent value does not exist? I would argue that it makes a heck of a lot more sense that I'll give you a good example. Okay, so this is why. Go back to intellectual disability. Someone that has a 40 IQ, are they as valuable as someone who has 140 IQ?
Yes.
Not really. Not really. Let's be blunt. How many people here's best friend has a 40 IQ? How many people want to go on a date with a person with a 40 IQ? How many people are looking to hire somebody with a 40 IQ? How many people are running around thinking, I want to look at that magazine that has somebody on the cover with a 40 IQ? When was the last time you saw a magazine with someone on the cover with a 40 IQ?
I'm a good straight man, all right.
In my view, the only foundation for the premise that everyone has equal value, the only argument that justifies everybody in this room having equal, in my view, now I'm not a political philosopher, is the idea that they are each and every one made by a divine being who wishes for them and who has created them in the image of beauty and truth and goodness. And that creation as a whole intends toward that beauty and truth and goodness. So to me, the radical faith-based premise is not that we should give the greatest good to the greatest number, but that we should enter into relationships of self-sacrificing love that liberates the goodness of all people. Dorothy Day, Jean Vanier, the great saints of churches, not just the Christian tradition, believe in unlocking the greatness of every human being, not because they were utilitarians and trying to distribute goods, but because every person, first and foremost, was a creation of the divine. Every being was a creation of the divine. In my view, the secular argument runs afoul, in part when you get, so why should I be infusing my spirituality? I would say to the person of no faith, of course everybody has the right to have no faith, and I wouldn't impose my religion on anyone, and I don't have any aspiration to impose my religion. I have enough problems with my religion myself, not to mention imposing it on somebody else. But I would work with every ounce of energy I've got to impose that radical spiritual ideal that everybody counts, and that self-sacrificing love is the key to unlocking the giftedness of every human being, and that should be the foundation of a great country, in my view. And
the reason I answered yes is I share your premise, on where the value of all human beings comes from. But I just want to press you once more on this question, because in Harris Wofford, from his time in the Civil Rights Movement, and I think support me on this, is that when you looked at, say, the people who gave of themselves, sometimes gave their lives in the Civil Rights Movement, many of them were people without religious faith. Obviously, Martin Luther King, and not so much the movement was rooted in the African church, but there were plenty of very great people who were selfless in the Civil Rights Movement, who did so as agnostics, atheists, non-believers. While many people of faith were the people holding the hoses, were
right.
the people. And so, again, I will come to you as the secular person and say, what are you saying to me? I clearly
here's what I'm saying to you. I'm saying to you, you're a lousy atheist. You're a lousy atheist. That's what I've had this discussion. I mean, there's a lot of lousy believers. There's a lot of lousy Christians and Jews and Muslims. But there's a lot of lousy atheists too. And I don't believe that their argument, their self-professed, now, I mean, this is a journey of the inner life. I'm not judging them. I mean, who knows what inchoate challenges and desires and fears and searches they're embarking on when they say, ultimately, I've decided I can't see the God that you see. I mean, I take the people very seriously, incredibly about that, but I don't think, I think they continue, many people continue, they go at it again, they try, they reach out, they challenge themselves to stand in front of that hose, in part because they long for that sense that maybe that person, that search for justice, that goodness and truth, maybe it does matter. Maybe we're not spinning in an unwieldy world, headed toward chaos and disaster. Maybe we're not just conglomerations of molecules. Maybe it does matter. Maybe there is something there. Maybe we are headed to value. Maybe there is a God. How they manage that question and how they intellectually reconcile or spiritually reconcile those questions, I'm not going to judge, but I don't believe you can look at Eddie Barbanel, who's got Down syndrome, who gets called names on his job, or look at who can stand up here and make you smile by doing his recitation of Romeo and Juliet. I don't think you can value him. I don't think you can take the experience of African American, if you take the civil rights movement that started the Dred Scott decision. Start right in the face of it. No, you're not a full human being. No, you are not, and we'll put it in writing. You don't count. That's where that journey has its great marker, in my view. It is an explicit statement, in my view, a faithless statement, that there is a human being that does not count as much. Right on the table. And the journey that you have to travel to undo that, not just undo it in law, but undo it in your heart, I believe is a spiritual journey. In my experience, it has been.
I want to challenge you to write a spiritual bestseller called You're a Lousy Atheist. Wonderful book. I'm going to ask one more of my questions, and I want to open it up to everyone, and I'll reserve the right to come back in arbitrarily if I want to. Yeah, I want to ask that question that you suggested, which is the difference between your faith and your religion.
I think I've tried to articulate a little bit here. I think the difference is that religious experience, that which precedes words, precedes creed, precedes practice, is frequently overlooked by religions. Religions tend to simplify the learnings from the great mystics, whether the mystic is Jesus or Isaiah or Muhammad. They tend to say, okay, well, we've sorted all this out, and now we can tell you what they really mean. What they really mean is go to Mass on Sunday or keep holy the Sabbath or thou shalt not kill. It was very interesting, actually. Of the Ten Commandments, last Sunday in the Catholic tradition, we read the Ten Commandments. And the priest spoke about what commandments he hears in the confessional. And children confess to not honoring their mothers and fathers, and adults confess to being envious, occasionally some of the others too. But what do you think is the commandment least often confessed?
Idolatry.
No? Well, it might be, but this wasn't his answer. His answer was the first: you shall love God. Now, so what's the difference between faith and religion? Faith invites you first to love God, and to do that from within. You don't love somebody by showing up for dinner or buying groceries. You love someone before you marry them, before you hold them, all that. You love someone from within. The great challenge in my view, of faith, and again, I know Father Reese is here, and these are people who are powerfully published in this space and well schooled in it, so I don't want to overstretch my
But he's a
capacity.
political scientist.
But I think that's the big difference. I think the experience precedes the language. The invitation of the mystics is to explore your experience, to feel and know that God alone suffices, to know that what you are looking for is what is looking, to hear Meister Eckhart say, let God be God in you. To hear Dorothy Day say, when you feed someone else, you feed Christ. That's an invitation to reorder your experience, your faith, not to follow a commandment. The commandment comes second. I think faith brings people enormous common ground across religions and even across people who are religious and non-religious. And I think basically the reason why we read in the polls now, I mean, you saw the poll the other day, 15% downtick in people who are adhering to religion. The fastest growing religion in the United States is spiritual and not religious. Why? In my view, people are looking inward. They are trying to figure this out for themselves. They have not given up on the idea of the divine, but they have given up on the idea that they're going to find it in a place that just tells them what to do. They don't want to be told what to do. They don't want to be told my way or the highway. They don't want to be told this is the only way. It doesn't make sense to people anymore. What they want to do is they want to search their questions. And they want a community of people to do on their own the work of searching their questions. Faith is about your questions. Religion tends to be too much about your answers.
Thank you. Your mention of Ten Commandments reminded me of my favorite critique of the contemporary media, where the reporter is sent to cover Moses getting the Ten Commandments from God. He calls his the producer calls his editor, and the editor says, "How many did God give?" And he said 10. He said, 10. You've only got a minute 20. Give us a piece on the three most important commandments. And I've always thought it might be an interesting exercise for journalism students to see which three they would pick and do a piece on. Who wants to join this conversation? I always say no one likes to ask. Oh, good. No one likes to ask the first question. You're a great person. I was going to say consider it the second question, please.
I'm going to make one comment and one question. And my comment is I was shaking my head feverishly when you mentioned the Special Olympics Unified Teams because it just resonated so much with me that you're not serving others, you're serving with others, because my experience was for several years with DC Special Olympics bowling and also the soccer. And I'm a Georgetown graduate, like many people here, and there I was bowling with side by side with people over in Northeast that were much, much better bowlers than I was. And I did that every week for several weeks. And soccer, there we were playing together. And it's just, it does keep with you forever, like you said, long after Disney World. So I'm just a testimony for that. And then my question is, it's more to ask you to comment on the I don't know if you both saw the campaign on the metro and the buses by the atheist group that was do good for good's sake. So that sort of resonated.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a vigorous debate. Obviously, atheism has had a good run the last couple of years. Very strong books, big bestsellers, lots of compelling arguments, lots of good TV time. Hitchens makes for a great interview. So does Sam Harris. These people are knocking the ball out of the park when it comes to attracting attention, and they make some good points. You know, Letters to a Christian Nation. You know, when you think through some of the implications of the ways in which people use their faith to demonize others, their religions have something to account for here. And then part of, I think, that critique, the atheist critique, if we can call it that, at least the contemporary one, is a challenge to religious leaders and to religious institutions to rethink some of the premises and rethink some of the ways in which they're communicating their teachings to the faithful. You know, it doesn't come any, I mean, you know, the idea that the Pope oughtn't to have readmitted this bishop or oughtn't to have said this particular thing doesn't do anything for me to challenge my belief in the divine. It only makes me search harder. I mean, because I'm not, I just, you know, maybe I'm lucky or maybe I'm psychotic. I just can't get the question off my mind. I think about it night and day. I wonder, I search, I look at you, and I think to myself, what's your religious experience? I mean, I'm wacky this way, so I don't get self-conscious or anything. But I'm kind of relentlessly curious about the presence of the divine. So I think there's a huge treasure of religious wisdom and insight in the Catholic tradition, Jewish tradition. I don't think the churches in general have done a very good job of unlocking it, and as a result I think the atheist positions have gained more credibility than they deserve, but I think that's the fault of people in positions of leadership in religion, and I count myself in that. I mean, I'm not waiting for the Pope to answer all their questions either, or some bishop or some rabbi. I think it's on all of us to take faith seriously.
How much do you think our response to faith is actually deeply rooted in our experiences growing up? I know it's true of you, and I know it's true of myself, that faith always resonated with me in part because I saw it in my parents' life, and that I did not see them as hypocritical advocates of a particular set of beliefs, and it mattered to them, and it always seemed plausible to me in part because of the way in which they enacted the faith in their lives. And I've often wondered, and this is an argument that can work for the atheist as much as for the believer, how do we disentangle that? Because clearly the whole experience of faith is rooted in very early experiences, responses to those experiences, which we carry with us in one way or another, consciously or unconsciously. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that. And I guess it goes to a direct kind of biographical question, which is, you know, what was growing up in this particular very spiritual family? How does that link to what you sort of believe now, or believe about what you believe now?
Well, I would say you can't disentangle anything from your parents, right? Everything is somehow either attributed to or screwed up by your parents or given to you by your parents. So I won't try to. I think that the question about, you know, am I a Catholic, more, you know, how much of my parents being Catholics, I mean, probably a heck of a lot, right? I mean, But I don't necessarily, I will say that when I heard Augustine say, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, I heard something that wasn't Catholic. Or what I heard, oh, my heart's restless. That's true. I didn't hear, I heard that the faith tradition that I had was giving me a chance to find a place to be restless, to be in search of the divine. Now, that wasn't, I don't think my parents meant for me to do it that way. I think they thought, they came out of a early 20th century Catholic tradition full of apologetics, Baltimore Catechism, adversarial relationship with the larger culture, humiliated, at least in my grandparents' generation, by dominant mainstream Protestant paradigms, fighting for money, respect, attention, credibility, fighting to remove the stigma of Catholicism. It's voodoo, it's hocus pocus, it's magic, it's miracles, it's statues, it's crazy cults. They wanted to fight to figure out how to make that Catholic thing okay. I didn't have that fight. That's not my fight. It's partly, I suppose, but my journey was to make sense of the divine from within. So I guess I'd answer the question, EJ, by saying what was good about what my parents gave me was enough latitude to find in my tradition the resources that I feel like I needed to live my own religious journey. And for that, I'm very grateful. And I don't, maybe somebody else has different experiences on that.
Please.
I was going to address that one, but I was going to ask the question, actually, maybe EJ.
Could you speak up just so everybody can hear you?
Actually, EJ, I was interested in the comment about, how to change the message.
How do you
change the message?
And I was actually wondering, I would love to hear maybe some of your comments,
Yeah.
because arguably President.
It's more fun to just play around.
Yeah.
And no offense, but I mean, arguably President Kennedy's, campaign back in the days actually has hindered the cause rather than furthered the cause of trying to get people to, really look at folks that actually do base themselves in centered self-service sense of spirituality as assets rather than liabilities. And so I just wanted you to talk about that and
No, that's a great question. If you didn't hear it in the back, and make sure I'm faithful to your question, that in some ways didn't President Kennedy's campaign set back the cause of those who are arguing for a connection between their spirituality and their faith and public.
and how do we change the message
And how,
today?
yeah. I think there is something to your question. There's a great story. First of all, if you read the Houston speech that Kennedy gave, the speech to the Houston ministers, where he was essentially saying that his faith would have nothing to do with what he did in office, and that if there were ever a conflict, which of course there wouldn't be, he would resign. It is one of the most relentlessly secular speeches ever given by any politician in our history. And there's a great story that Arthur Schlesinger tells in his memoirs, where Schlesinger, Sorensen, and Kennedy were in a room, and Theodore Sorensen, the great speechwriter, had written a speech for Kennedy, and Kennedy threw it back at him and said, "This speech is way too, you Unitarians write me speeches that are way too Catholic." He said, "Sometimes I think I'm the only Protestant in the room," Kennedy said. And so I do think there is a sense in which the argument that was necessary at that time for him to make was that there was an absolute separation of his faith from his public life. And indeed, Schlesinger also said that it was very hard, in fact, in Kennedy's case, to discern any connection between his faith and his public life. Although Sean Casey, by the way, for those who are interested in this, there's a wonderful guy at the Wesley Seminary who's just written a book called The Making of the Catholic President, 1960, something like that, which is about the role of Catholicism in that campaign. And there's fascinating new stuff, and it begins actually with an incident involving Sergeant Shriver trying to persuade Stevenson to put Kennedy on the ticket in 1956. But it's a wonderful book. And I think that my own theory about this is that we've gone through various waves in our history where our politics was more or less linked to religion and culture, and that the example I like to give is 1928 versus 1932. The 1928 election was almost entirely about religion and culture. Should Al Smith be the first Roman Catholic president? Should we continue our national experiment with prohibition? Catholics lose, prohibition wins, and then on October 29, 1929, the market crashes, and we enter the Great Depression. By 1932, culture and religion mattered a whole lot less to a lot of people, and a Democrat in Missouri wrote a letter to Jim Farley, Roosevelt's political guy, saying, I don't understand why a wet Democrat would argue with a dry Democrat over liquor when neither of them can afford the price of a drink. And then we went through a long period of relatively secular politics, which I date 1932 to 1980. Now, that did not mean that presidents didn't speak about spirituality. Mike Gerson, President Bush's speechwriter, came to my class here. I hope that's not my... That is my editor. Can you take...
Jeez.
You answer the question.
I'm not going to answer that. Other comments, questions? Yes, Father Reed.
I'm curious if you could talk a little more about your faith journey. Was it a gradual, incremental journey, or were there, getting knocked off your horse, like St. Paul experiences that happened to you? You mentioned, the experience in the high school and how, and then you later saw that you were with people rather than for people and this kind of thing. I was just wondering were there particular moments in your life where things happened that were transformational?
Well, fair question. No, there was not. I have not had the charism of St. Paul to be knocked off my horse. Although I would, I'm always looking for the chance. I would welcome it if the divine so seeks to find me here. I would say mine has been more of a gradual. I think, I have to say that my study of the mystics was a transformative experience for me. And in particular, my study of Lonergan. I don't want to get into Lonergan, it's very technical, but when I read a great Jesuit, one of the greatest at the time living Jesuit theologians, write about religion as the question of God, I was stunned. I was so mesmerized by the idea that before everything comes the question. That our native, as he said, our native orientation toward the divine begins as an internal search, and I was fascinated by that. I just had I had never heard that. I never understood that. I knew. I went to. I became very disillusioned with mental health. When I was a teacher, I was studying at the Yale Child Studies Center, studying child development, working with child psychiatrists, and at the same time working with these kids. And I can remember asking the director of the Yale Child Studies Center, enormously prominent child psychoanalyst, Al Solman, wonderful man. He took me on a long drive. He said, "You can come, and I don't have time to meet with you, but you can drive me." And so we went to give him he gave a lecture. And I can remember where I was when I said to him, "Dr. Solman, I'm asking you these things about these kids I'm working with. I'm trying to understand why I can't get through to them, what their problems are." I said, I keep thinking they're looking for meaning. And I said, "Doctor, how does a psychiatrist define meaning?" He said, "There's no definition, no meaning. It's just whatever the meaning of the symbol the person brings. There's no meaning except the meaning of whatever the person says." And I realized right then that there was, in this sort of secular versus religious worldview, that worldview wasn't good enough for me. But beyond that, the only other time I could say that had that kind of cathartic moment for me was also, it was reading Isaiah 58. These are things that are obscure. But, one day I was in a dorm, I was teaching in the summer program, the kids were raising all kind of hell, I couldn't control the place, nobody was listening to me. In the middle of a hot summer at the University of Connecticut, and I went up, and this is a good thing for parents, because my parents used to always send me prayer books. My daughter knows I do the same thing. But I never would read these prayer books. I get them, and they'd be flying around. Anyway, this one particular day, in my suitcase or something, they'd sent me a prayer book, so I had it. So I opened it up, because I was just at wit's end. And I read Isaiah 58, and there's a section where it says the beginning part of it is, if you release the bonds of those unjustly tied down, if you give your food to the poor, if you help feed the hungry, if you visit the prisoner. And then it goes, then your light...
I agree with whatever you said.
I'm in the middle of an important moment. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your midnight will be like the noonday.
Huh.
And it stunned me, because I thought to myself, it doesn't say you will go to heaven. It says now, your light will break forth like the dawn if you do these things. So I thought to myself, wow, there's some connection here between my happiness, my sense of satisfaction, my sense of connection to people, and this work that I've been told I ought to do. But I didn't understand it, but I knew, these are points at which I realized I had to take different tacks on my journey, I guess. So I never blew it up. I never said to hell with it. I never said I can't stand this stuff any longer. I did not do a wholesale see you later to religion like a lot of people do, and come back, so to speak. I don't have that journey.